I thought what we could kind of, tease out is just in our own life, thinking about the examples that people have set for us. Hopefully there's some good examples that we can point to in our lives, but maybe there's some bad examples too that, sometimes learning what not to do is as helpful as learning what to do. Yeah, I think that's where we'll go today, is just thinking about the examples that we have in our own lives and what they've meant to us.
Welcome to the Four Lake Norman podcast. And the reason we named the podcast the Four Lake Norman podcast is because at Lake Norman Baptist Church, our mission is to bring healing, connection, and purpose to people all around Lake Norman through the love of Jesus. And if you want to know more about what that means practically, or what we hope that means for our community, you can listen to last week's podcast episode. That's what we dove into and talked about for almost an hour and a half. And I got to say, Anson, it's going to be hard to top that episode for me.
That was a good conversation.
It was one of my favorites. So, but we're back again today, and on we go. Because we're continuing the For God and Neighbor sermon series. We both got the sweater memo today.
We're wearing our crew neck sweaters.
Yep.
That's not like a normal move for either of us, I don't think.
Yeah. I'm not a big sweater guy.
Neither am I.
This winter, I've been more of a sweater guy than in previous years of my life.
Yeah.
But
I think my wife got me this sweater for my birthday.
Nice.
And so
nice.
I'm wearing it.
This was a Target find.
Nothing wrong with that?
Yeah. The reason it wasn't this sweater, but it was one like it. The reason I got it is because I didn't pack enough outfits for a wedding I was going to, and I had to go buy
an emergency sweater.
Yes.
Nice. Well, it's looking good. I like it.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
So since we're here in our sweaters, how about you
segue?
Yeah. How about you
find a good sweater segue?
How about you share
I'll weave together a connection to what we're going to talk about.
Yes, that would be great.
So we're in the second week of our new series, For God and Neighbor, where what we want to get into each week is, what does that look like? What does it look like for us to love God and love the people around us, and to be driven by that? The case I made last week in the sermon, 2 weeks ago in the sermon, was this is the why. That consistently, when Jesus was asked, all right, at the core, what's it all about? He said, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Neither of which is natural to us as human beings. We're naturally very self-absorbed, selfish creatures. And so, maturing in life from infancy into just personal maturity, and also in our spiritual lives, from spiritual infancy to spiritual maturity, is really a process of becoming less and less selfish and self-absorbed, and more others-focused and more God-focused. And so to love God and love neighbor are really tied together, and they're marks of spiritual maturity. And I think that's goes right in hand with just personal maturity in life as well. Those two things complement each other. So that's the why. Why do we live the way we do? More and more, it should be driven by the why of love for God and neighbor. Doing this because I love that person. I do this because I'm motivated by the love of God. I do, what I do increasingly driven by the motivation of love. So that's what we want to get at. And in 6 weeks, we're walking through another section of Luke, We've been saying this. We're reading through the Gospel of Luke, and he's getting closer and closer to the time where he's going to be crucified. And so these are the chapters, Luke 16 through 19, leading up to that time. So we're in Luke 17 this week, and seeing how the teaching of Jesus shows us a dimension of being motivated by love for God and neighbor. And what he gets at in the first part of Luke 17 is the example that we set for others. He opens up with this warning, and he says, hey, don't be the one who causes someone else to stumble, because that's not the example you want to set. And he speaks a pretty strong word of warning, like, hey, you don't want to be that person, when when Judgment Day comes. And then he follows that up with a few sort of pieces of what a good example would look like, or areas of life where we might set a good example or we might set a bad example. Obviously, we want to set a good one, right? And those areas are forgiveness, faith, and service. And so I think you tie these things together, which is what we've been doing really since the beginning of the year, getting these stories and parables and teachings of Jesus, noticing how the gospel writer Luke kind of ties them together. And in this section, I think this is a pretty easy one to see how they hold together, because he opens up with, hey, what kind of example are you setting in the area of forgiveness, in the area of faith, and in the area of serving others? And so I unpacked that in the sermon. We kind of talk about how that falls out in the sermon. But for us today, I just think, we have had examples in our lives from childhood right on up. And I'm curious how those examples have shaped us. So just in preparing for our podcast today, I'm just trying to think about, okay, what have the examples been like in my life of these areas, and how has it shaped me? And I'd be curious, for you as well, how you've seen examples in your life of these three categories.
Yeah, no, I think I think it's always good to reflect on both positive and negative examples we've had in our lives and the lessons that you learn from those. And it kind of goes back to some of the stuff we were talking about last week, where in our culture, we don't often give ourselves the time to think about that type of thing.
Right.
So yeah, even as preparing for this, I found it hard to even, think of examples, because I don't give myself enough space to think about that type of thing.
So we're going to take a minute and think about it. And maybe that'll be helpful for you if you're listening, to just stop and reflect for a minute on the examples in your own life. And, that's an opportunity to be grateful for the good examples, and maybe even to be grateful for the bad examples, because a lot of times learning what not to do can be as helpful for us as learning what to do. Tucker just took a sip of coffee, and he's about to fall out here. So
yeah,
that's all right.
Forgive me.
There you go. You're back.
I'm back.
That wasn't too bad.
That was quicker than it normally is.
I've had those experiences that took me a lot longer. Yeah. So I'll give you a minute to recover. I'll share kind of from my end. Yes. So the first category is forgiveness, and in the teaching of Jesus, particularly, he focuses on repeated forgiveness. Like, how many times should we forgive someone when they offend us? And he says 7 times a day if you have to. In the Bible, 7 is a number of completion. So what he's saying is as often as you need to, and specifically as often as there is an offense, and then, repentance and a request for forgiveness, we should be willing to extend forgiveness. Now, of course, right out of the gate, that opens up all sorts of questions about like abuse and things like that. So Jesus is not, like so many times we have to say what we're not saying. We're not saying roll over and take abuse, but like within a healthy relationship, we should be willing to forgive over and over and over again as part of our call, and part of following Jesus' example, God's example. And so I think about my own life and the examples of patient forgiveness. Maybe for anybody, certainly for anybody that has kids, but I mean, even just in the family dynamics that we have, I think our family dynamics as people, these are the people that we're the closest to in life. So we have the most opportunities to offend one another. the people that live in the same house,
Yeah.
go on the same vacations, share the same, space and vehicles and all those things. So within our families, I think the opportunities for forgiveness are probably more than in any other
Yeah.
relationship, just because of proximity,
Mhm.
right? And then also the people that you're closest to tend to be the people. Not saying it's a good thing, but they tend to be the people that we're the least filtered around.
Mhm.
We'll put on our best behavior for people outside of our
Right.
families, but within our families, that's where sometimes we're the worst versions of ourselves. And so I think in general, the family context is where forgiveness may be the most needed in our culture. And I just, I think about people in my life right now, and I just know several parents whose grown kids have just not only kind of gone a different path from their parents, but are kind of actively hostile
Mhm.
toward their parents,
Mhm.
um, for no evident good reason except for just almost like spite for what
Mhm.
their parents believe and what their parents stand for. Um, and there's in anything in life there's two-way streets and whatnot, but like gives all the appearance of a parent who is doing their level best and has done,
Mhm.
but continually extends forgiveness for kind of this hostility that's coming from their kids. Sometimes it's around faith and what we believe, and other times it's just around other interpersonal things. And it's not, so these are the people that I find myself interacting with a lot. It's just a very common thing that um, parents of a certain life stage are just living through a situation where there's
Mhm.
a lot of difficulty around those relationships. And so I'm watching some friends of mine set an example of patient forgiveness, of just again and again and again extending grace and opening the doors of the home and welcome into the family again and again, um, where it's difficult.
Mhm.
It's difficult. I also know of some family situations where it's the opposite, and it's where parents have committed some really harsh offenses against their own kids, whether they were young or when they
Mhm.
were older, and it's the kids who have extended forgiveness to their parents and continue to do it over and over and over again for the sake of love, like out of love for their family members. So as I think about the people that I interact with in life on both ends of that spectrum, and it's not always parent child or child parent, there are other family
Mhm.
dynamics as well, but those two are the ones that stand out to me as I can think of, names and faces of people that I know that I look to the way that they're conducting themselves, and it's an example for me.
Mm.
It's an example for me that helps me think about my own actions, in my family. In some ways, it's a cautionary tale to go, I don't wanna be I don't wanna be the offender in these situations, and I can see what causes such deep offense. But also, I want to be open to forgive in the way that, that these people in my life are setting an example of. So, when I think about that category of patient, consistent forgiveness, those are the
Mhm.
examples that come to mind for me.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I've seen that. Um, I think I mentioned in last week's podcast, I have a group of guys that I meet with, and like, we're having real, honest conversations, being
Mhm.
vulnerable about things we're struggling with, working through, and some of the stuff we talk about is we acknowledge like the impact how we were raised has on us, and all of us like have great parents. It's not that we love our
Mhm.
parents. So, it's not that we think they were terrible
Mhm.
or whatever, but each family dynamic has a certain type of impact on us, and there's all kinds of science behind it, regarding, like, attachment styles and things like
Yeah.
that. Um, but one of the guys has shared, you know, just grew up in a house where emotions never really got talked about. When relational conflict would come, they'd have it out and then never come back and talk about it, never
Mhm.
resolve conflict. So things just got stuffed down. Um, there wasn't really any vulnerability or anything like that. So emotional intelligence was low, and just a lack of awareness of how to process negative emotions when they
Mhm.
come was not modeled. So we're talking about examples. I think, you know, I'm not a parent yet, but I think parents inevitably are going to set some positive examples and some
Mm.
negative examples for their kids. And I think with the forgiveness aspect, one thing we've talked about in our group is like, while that may be the case of how we were raised, we recognize our parents were doing with the best that they
Mhm.
could with what they had at the time. And so we're choosing to forgive them in that and not harbor bitterness or resentment.
Yeah.
Um, and in this guy's particular case, like it's, you know, s- some of the way he was raised even influenced him developing an addiction later in life, and,
Mhm.
figured out some of the root cause of that was tied to the way he was raised. But even with that, still had the heart to forgive and to not hold it against, um, his parents, which I thought was pretty powerful.
Yeah, that is. And when we hear those examples, a lot of times the stories that we hear are situations that are more severe than our own story.
Mhm.
And I think the ability to see that and apply it to, okay, if that person has
Mhm.
been willing to forgive that level of offense, well, then who am I to hang on to
Mhm.
my unforgiveness toward this
Yeah.
person in my life that, is nowhere near that level of offense. And so I think those examples are
Mhm.
helpful for us. Um, I think I was just sort of ruminating on what does it take to be an example, especially in this category. Um, Areas of forgiveness are kind of sensitive topics, right? Because
Mhm.
that means there's been an offense.
Mhm.
That means there's stuff going on that's not it's not what you want. Um, so in order for someone to set an example, they're going to have to share that story
Mhm.
and be vulnerable or be close enough to people that they know them well enough that you could see how someone is living. So I think for any of us to be the example setter,
Mhm.
then we got to allow people into our lives.
Mhm.
And for us to receive an example from somebody, we've got to be close enough to those people to actually know some of the messier parts of life.
Mhm.
So I think, how can we both find examples and be examples like we run into so often? It comes
Mhm.
in, it comes down to community and living,
Mhm.
living, knowing people well enough and being known by people well enough that we can be examples for one
Yeah.
another and learn from each other.
Yeah, because I think, you can set yourself up for failure if you're looking only at the positives of like an example or figure that you can look
Hmm.
up to. And then one day you find out some scandal they're a part of, and it just crushes your whole worldview
Right.
because who you were looking up to and putting on a pedestal,
Hmm.
you never considered the fact that they have weaknesses too.
Yeah.
And so then, like, when stuff like that comes to light, it just is like earth shattering. So, yeah, to your point, I think both being the example, but also having examples who are willing to share their failures with you is like indispensable in our culture. Like, I
Yeah.
think it's so necessary. And that's where, like, I think groups at church, when they're multi generational, I think that's the biggest benefit of it is to
Hmm.
be in a room with guys. For me as a young guy, being in a room with guys older than me who can share with me some of the failures
Yeah.
they've had in
Yeah.
life that I'll probably run up against at some
Yeah.
point, and hear, how they handled it, what God taught them through it, and then, try and avoid those same pitfalls. And I think another thing that popped into my mind since we're talking about the topic of forgiveness is just like you said, we're talking about in healthy relationships,
Hmm.
but there is that other side of the coin where there's very unhealthy and dysfunctional relationships, and I think forgiveness is still possible in those scenarios, but one thing I had to learn is that forgiveness and reconciliation are 2
Yeah.
different things.
Yeah.
A lot of times we like to conflate them and say it's
Yeah.
the same, but you can forgive someone without necessarily reconciling the
Right.
relationship. Because forgiveness requires just you, reconciliation requires both parties having the humility to repent and to
Right.
come back together. So I just think that's important to throw out with this
I
as well.
agree. And I think probably those are the areas where we most need good examples
Mhm.
of people modeling that
Mhm.
for us
Mhm.
who have been wrestled with that tension. And I can think of some people that I know well
Mhm.
that I believe have genuinely extended forgiveness, but that doesn't mean that the entire relationship has been restored.
Mhm.
And they walk in that tension,
Mhm.
and have discovered, learned to have peace
Yeah.
with God and with others, even in those imperfect situations. And we need good examples of those,
Yeah.
as well as good examples of people who were willing to be reconciled when it was a reciprocated
Mhm.
reconciliation. Yes, so all of these things, it's almost like the more difficult it is,
Yeah.
the more we need some good examples,
Mhm.
and we need to know people well enough that we can see that much of their life to learn from it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, in this conversation too, thinking about who around us might not have those examples,
Right.
because there's a lot of broken homes out there, and we may come from a family where there's at least more good examples than there are bad examples, but what is our responsibility for those who there's not a good example anywhere you look,
Mm,
Like, how can we, as Christians, enter into that space?
yeah. Yeah. No, that's good. And that's one of the areas I think as a church can and should be a priority for us.
Mhm,
Helping connect people and create the kinds of environments and
mhm,
conversations where, yeah, we can help people learn from one another. We can all learn from each other.
mhm,
So yeah, setting an example, especially in the area of forgiveness. Yeah, there's a lot of some specific dynamics there.
mhm,
I think for us to think about.
yeah,
Shift to the second one. The next area that Jesus talks about is confident faith, and in this idea of one person's faith can rub off on someone else. One person's lack of faith can rub off on someone else. And here's Jesus, talking to these followers of the new way, of his way, and everyone's faith was new faith in
mhm,
him. Um, and so I think there's a warning of Jesus to say, hey, if someone's taking steps of faith toward me, who was about to lay down his life, you know, for their forgiveness and eternal salvation, and
mhm,
someone is moving toward him, he's warning people like, hey, don't be the person who derails someone else's faith because of your own lack of faith or whatever the reason is, your own selfishness. And so this is an area where I think we want and need good examples and can learn from the bad examples as well. Uh, One that comes to mind for me, I have a friend who is about to have a pretty significant surgical procedure, has gone through a really painful journey to get there, and it's the kind of thing that's it's hopefully a once in a lifetime. Like, oh man, it's never been this bad before. This is a big deal, and just processing the natural anxieties and fears and questions and going to different doctors and trying to get different answers and finding conflicting opinions and all these things, and just trying to navigate all of that, as well as the physical pain involved in what's going on. Came to an appointment not long ago where it was just very clear to this person that that God had lined up, sort of, we call them divine appointments. It's like there were all the earmarks that God had worked in all these various situations to bring them into a conversation with a particular doctor that had a particular set of experience, that there was a particular like relational connection. So all these different things came together in this one appointment after a string of frustrating and unsuccessful appointments, that it was like, okay, the sky kind of parted here, and now we have some clarity. And not only clarity on what the next step should be, but confidence that we're taking the right steps. And because of the way this all came together, it just had a fingerprint of God on it that was like, we couldn't have asked for a more confidence boosting, situation than we've found. Now there still is going to be surgery and all those things, but the anxiety level and the uncertainty level came way, way down. And the way this person talks about it is, I see that as evidence that God is always at work and that he cares about me. He cares about us in the details of our lives. And if he cares that much about this particular situation in our lives, that builds my faith that he cares about all the other situations in my life as well. And he cares about the situations in my friends and family's lives and people's lives at large. And so, this person's story, I think it's a great example of confident faith in the midst of a very difficult, the situation is still difficult, but the perspective on it is a 180 from what it could be, without this lens of seeing and trusting and believing the hand of God is on him and leading forward. And so that faith, as I hear the story and think about it and process it, and I think about situations in my life, things that I'm fearful about, have anxiety about, very different kinds of situations, but my faith grows in my own life because of the way that my friend is processing his own. So very recent in my life, I would say that's a great example that someone is setting for me. It's just a reminder to put my faith in God, in the tangible stuff of life.
Yeah, and I think those examples where like our health is being attacked is actually, really good. I was listening to a podcast with a guy named Ronald Rollhauser, I think is his name, something like that.
I like how you did that. You're like, Rollhauser Stein.
Yeah, something. But he's I'm pretty sure he's a pastor, and he's had cancer 3 different times. Like, thought he beat it, then it came back. Thought he beat it, and then it came back. And he was talking about how that experience of suffering shaped how he viewed faith. And he kept mentioning how Jesus throughout the Gospels says to have faith like a child, and like let the children come, and like it's constantly talking about the way that children interact, and he uses the term faith with that. And growing up, I always thought that meant like, oh yeah, well, kids are like quick to believe things you tell them. They're kind of, they don't think all the logic and reason around something. They're just like quick to trust, quick to believe.
Like simple faith, simplistic, I guess.
Yeah, or just like
or like gullible.
More of like an intellectual, like they're quicker to come to an intellectual, like, yeah, I believe that to be true.
Okay.
I guess is the way I used to think about it. But what he was saying is when Jesus is saying have faith like a child, it's more about dependence.
Right.
Because like if a parent doesn't feed a child's not going to eat. And so when Jesus is saying have faith like a child, come to me like a child, it's depend on me as a child would a parent. And I think the more I've learned and thought about what does faith mean in the Bible, it's not this intellectual belief in a set of facts. It is that like you trust Jesus enough to depend on him. you trust that he is the truth, the way, and the life, and
Mm-hmm.
um, that dependence, I think, gets refined and shaped when we experience moments where our sense of control over our life is stripped away, and you kind of have to depend. So, like that pastor experiencing cancer, like your
Yeah.
friend experiencing um, this big surgery he's about to have. Like
Yeah.
my story with this would be my grandma recently had just had a ton of health issues going on, and she ended up having to go to the hospital and stay there
Mm-hmm.
for a while recently. And the way it all happened was a faith builder for me as well, um, because my brother, who I don't think had stopped by their house since probably Christmas time, randomly went by on I want to say it was a Monday or Tuesday afternoon to drop off. My grandma's a big fan of Elvis, like huge, huge Elvis fan.
Yeah.
And he had found some magazine with Elvis on the cover and was going to take it to her. You know, just the most random thing. And, she had apparently experienced all these things the night before, and he gets over there and she's not looking really good. And, you know, after a while, he's like, okay, well, let me call my mom and, get them here because my mom's a nurse. And my mom said after the fact, like, if he wouldn't have stopped by and seen how she was and, like, they were able to call an ambulance and get her to the hospital,
Right.
she doesn't know what would have happened. And
Mm-hmm.
it was because of an Elvis magazine. And I was like,
Yeah.
what, there's no
God can use all kinds of things, right?
situations like that
Yeah.
where you're like, there's just no coincidences. And God cares
Yeah.
about so many things in our life that we don't have any control over, but he
Yeah.
does, and he's working behind the scenes to move things around, and that gives us the ability to depend on him
Yeah.
even when things aren't making sense or things are really scary. Um, and so, yeah, that uh, the recent one that comes to mind for me is also health related,
Yeah.
ironically.
Yeah. And you're right. I mean, here I am. I'm starting to think of another health related one. So maybe that's the theme. But it occurs to me, it's like enough of these like episodes of recognizing God's hand at work, I think, can add up to a generalized confident faith in God that just, whatever happens is going to be his plan.
Mhm.
And I think about my own parents and the example that they've set for me, really for my whole life, but more recently as they're aging.
Mhm.
A couple years ago, my mom had a heart attack just out of nowhere, wound up having a quadruple bypass, and pretty big deal.
Mhm.
So the procedure I was talking about a minute ago is serious, but not, unless something goes wrong. It's not like a life-threatening thing. Quadruple bypass is like you're going to die if you don't get on the table. And
Mhm.
but just as my mom went through that journey, she went through it the same way she goes through everything else, and she was like, if it's my time, it's my time. And I mean, not that there wasn't some
Right.
natural fear and anxiety about the procedure, but the overarching faith that she demonstrated just throughout all of it and afterwards, which was, it was just, yeah, I mean, if I go home to heaven, all right, I'm sorry for
Yeah.
everyone's loss, but sometimes, sometimes in those conversations, it's almost like sometimes, I guess, showing my own maybe lack of faith, I'm like, maybe you could show a little more concern,
Yeah,
like
you should be upset.
maybe that's a little like over faith, I don't know,
Yeah.
but I don't think so. I think what it shows is I actually believe all these things that we talk about. I actually believe what the Bible says, that heaven is better than earth. I actually believe that God has my time mapped out from before I was ever born.
Mhm.
So why should I, freak out about whether I'm going to live through this surgery or not? Because it's not in my hands. It's not in the doctor's hands. It's been in God's hands since before I was ever born. So if it's almost like either I believe it or I don't.
Mm-hmm.
And I say I believe it when I go to church and I'm in Bible studies and all the things. Do I believe it when, it's I'm going into, a quadruple bypass? And I hope that example strengthens me for, the times when I face things like that. But grateful for, and my dad would be very, very similar to my mom in that regard of just, yeah, either we have faith in God or we don't. So let's have faith in God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's Jesus says often in the Gospels, like, those who have ears to hear, let them hear. Those who have eyes to see, let them see.
Yeah.
And I think the longer you follow Jesus, the more tuned in you are
Yeah.
to see those faith building moments and to see, like, oh, I can depend on God. Like,
Yeah.
you stop to see things as just coincidences, and you're like, oh, okay, there's something
Yeah.
bigger going on here. Like, I can think of more stories. Our church has been in the student minute. Well, there's so many layers to this, because Evan in the student ministry starts, feeling convicted that he wants to, encourage his students to think about who they know in their schools and on their sports teams that don't have a church home, maybe don't know anything about
Yeah.
Jesus, and to start to try and build a relationship and
Yeah.
have conversations with them. And he starts talking about that. Then your next sermon series is the Forgotten Neighbor sermon series, and the way that he kind of culminated his is he had all of them think of at least one name to write on a door and to intentionally pray that they would come through the doors and have an experience with Jesus. And not even a week or two later, our whole congregation is doing that same thing, but writing it on a ball
Yeah.
that's going to go in the tower to
Yeah.
represent, like, this is who we're intentionally praying for. And it's like, you guys didn't talk about it.
Never did.
You didn't plan it, but the Spirit was moving behind the scenes. And, like, our church is, like, collectively across ministries moving in this direction. And then with that, Evan told a really cool story to our young adult community group the other night. One of his students, the name that she wrote on the door and then started intentionally praying for that week, I think the Wednesday after that Sunday, had a dream and came up to the student and said, I had a dream that you and me were having a Bible study together.
Wow.
And I was like, I mean, that's just,
Yeah.
that student didn't even have to go out of her way and make herself uncomfortable to, like,
Right.
talk to this
Initiate
person
a
about
conversation
Jesus.
or whatever. Yeah.
Jesus met her in a dream
How about that?
and then initiated the conversation, and the Spirit was just moving. And it's stuff like that it's, if you haven't been following Jesus a long time, you may just think, like, oh, that's weird. That's a weird dream to have.
Right.
When you start to know how God works, it's like, oh, wow, like,
Yeah. That was not a coincidence.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So
That's a good one.
I know.
Yeah.
And I could tell more connected to the whole, like,
Right.
praying for specific people
Yeah.
thing.
And it's good because faith doesn't
Yeah.
only apply to health crises,
Right. Yes.
although that's a big one.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, confident faith. And I think the examples that we have, I mean, even you telling that story builds my faith right now
Yeah.
in what we're doing.
That's what it did for me
So-
when Evan shared
Right.
it with us. And it's just this reminder. It goes back to, like, faith being this dependence. When we pray, we're showing that we depend on God to do things that are out of our control. And he shows up when we do that. When we're trying to, like, tight grip and have control over, like, all these different things, we're not surrendering those to God, and we're not depending on him with the outcomes. And
Yeah.
I feel like that's constantly what the Spirit's trying to help us grow in, is just the ability to, like, surrender to Jesus and just let him work in all areas of our lives.
Yeah.
I saw a video recently that I thought was so good. It was actually from, do you know the Christian comedian John Christ or Christ?
Christ. Yeah.
So he was, I don't even know what the context of this was, but he was talking about the fruits of the Spirit. And he was like, you know what I find really interesting? In the fruits of the Spirit, he says the only type of control that you should aspire to have is self-control. And he's like, we're all worried about what's happening in politics, and we, get all bent out of shape about it. And it's like, nope, you should just control yourself, or,
Can't control that. Yeah, we want to control everything else.
Yeah, this relationship over here is, out of whack, and you want to control how they're behaving and acting. Nope, you need to control yourself. Like, that's the fruit of the Spirit. And
pretty good.
Yeah, I was like, that's a good reminder, just to sum up, like, and I think it's tied with the faith as dependence.
Yeah,
because if we depend on God for the things we can't control, then we can focus on how we control ourselves and responding to those things that we can't control.
Yeah. And we need examples of all of this.
Yes.
And I think that just speaks to the journey that faith is.
Mm-hmm.
So at no point in our spiritual journey have we arrived and have perfect faith.
Mm-hmm.
So for someone who's just coming to faith for the first time, I think one of the natural barriers is, oh, wow, I just don't have much faith. I probably need to have way, way more faith than I do for Jesus to accept me and forgive me. And the reality is, no, just a measure of faith. And even in the teaching in Luke 17, Jesus talks about faith the size of a mustard seed, which is very, very little bit, very, very small amount of faith. And it grows through seeing examples and takes, a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. And that's kind of part of how our faith grows. And so I think coming back to the importance of being an example and finding good examples, it's just integrated into our own growth in faith in general, in all different categories. So set an example, find examples and set an example, forgiveness, faith. The last one is humble service. And this is where Jesus tells a parable, a lot of parables in this section that we've been going through. And he says, suppose, you're a servant or you have a servant, one of the two. And, they do their job serving the master, and then they come in from a hard day's work doing their job. Well, the next thing to do is to make dinner for the master, and then serve the master, and then they get to eat their dinner. And so the parable is like, okay, at the end of the day, like, should this servant be like, wow, look at what a great servant I am, Not only did I do my job, but I made, dinner for my master, and I waited till very last. He's like, no, you're the servant. You're just doing your job. Like, you're doing the next right thing, and that's what you're called to do. Like, and the point is, humility in service and just continuing to do the right thing, not because of the reward that may come, but because it's the right thing.
Yeah.
And I think about just the examples that are all around you and me. I think one of the ways that God has blessed our church in particular, and this is true for a lot of churches, but I know this one best, but there's a core of people in our church that are just the definition of humble service. For many years, decades in some cases, have been faithfully serving in various different capacities, whether it's sort of teaching and helping other people grow in their spiritual life in the same class for 30 years, whether it's kids or adults, to, practical helps of just anything goes, a need arises around the church. Somebody needs a ride or help with paying a bill or some sort of a physical, need. They just show up no matter when, no matter what, not looking for credit, not looking for any accolades. In fact, when they do get credit, they're kind of uncomfortable with that. It's like, no. I'm just doing the right thing, doing what God calls us to do. I'm so grateful for all the blessings God's given me. I'm not serving for anything but just the pure love of God and neighbor. I think you and I are blessed with a lot of good examples of that around us that we can see. And I think it's actually one of the graces in churches. I think it's one of the things that just God does in people's lives is cultivate a heart of humble service.
Mhm.
And not that there aren't people out, in the world at large. And there's plenty of people we could point to as well who are not following Jesus, who are also examples here. But I think there's something unique and at the heart of God among his people, and it's a work that God does. So I think it's both a common grace that God works in people's lives,
Mhm.
and it's also a particular grace that he works in the lives of his children to cultivate this heart of humble service. And when we see it, it sure is an encouragement to follow that example.
Yeah. Yeah, I can, I like you said, there's a million examples in our church that I could,
Yeah.
give, but I want to shout out my dad with this one actually because I've seen him for years. So he's a member of something called the Lions Club, which is
Mhm.
there's plenty of those around. Um and not just when I was playing football, but I mean, even well after I stopped playing and before I started playing, he has volunteered in helping run their Pee Wee football program that the Lions Club puts on in the town where I grew up.
Yeah.
And he volunteers his time to be an assistant coach for the middle school in my town. And he's not, his motivations for doing it are, he loves the sport, obviously, but he wants kids to experience that sport and have a positive experience, and he's willing to put in hours on top of hours to create that opportunity for them, and, like, I got the privilege of coaching alongside him, on the middle school team
Yeah.
one year when I was, doing online classes in college, and, just doing that with him was one of the coolest experience like,
Yeah.
I will never it was awesome.
Yeah.
And just seeing the way he coached these kids, he wasn't one of those coaches that's just, like, obsessed with winning or, like,
Mhm.
at all costs, like, that's not his motivation. He just wants these kids to live up to their potential and be the best player that they can be and also instill, like, just help them become better men, and,
Yeah.
um it was really cool for me to see that example, and it shaped how I was coaching a different position from him, but it shaped how I coached, uh, the guys that I was in charge of, and, um, still, I mean, shapes even how I view my role here at the church.
Mhm.
So, that I think that's an example of I don't think people think about coaches as a a role of humble service, but
Oh, man.
for my dad,
Yeah.
it definitely was.
Coaching, leadership, and the more
Yeah.
I'm in a leadership role, the more I see good leadership is absolutely humble
Mhm.
service.
Mhm.
I think sometimes we we look at prominent, powerful leaders and you think leadership is about power.
Mhm.
And in bad cases, sometimes it is, but the right kind of leadership is 1,000% service
Mhm.
and leveraging one's authority and level of influence to serve and empower the people that they're in leadership
Mhm.
um, over. And so to be under a good leader is to be served really well.
Mhm.
So yeah, the coaching is a great example
Mhm.
as a type of leadership.
Mhm.
But I think that's one area where when it's done right, and that's where you get like Jesus is the servant leader.
Mhm.
So we have a whole category of leadership
Yeah.
of service that's the greatest example of Jesus himself.
Yeah. Yeah, and I was in around some smaller churches growing up, and I remember just seeing the pastors be willing to do anything, and it
Hmm.
was, like, really impactful for me. Uh, they're willing to and that's true of our staff too.
Yeah.
We're medium-sized church, so
Right.
I'm not saying it's different here, but
Right.
I remember at those smaller churches, I mean,
Yeah.
they'll clean the whole building, they'll stack chairs, they'll show up at literally everything
Yeah.
and
Make it happen.
make it happen, and, um, that shaped me as well to
Yeah.
just when I was young in ministry, I was like, okay, nothing is above
Mhm.
but nothing is below,
Yeah.
you know, my even though I'm in a position of leadership. There's a pastor I've listened to a couple times named Joby Martin down in
Yeah.
Jacksonville,
Yeah.
actually.
Oh, yeah. I'm real familiar
Um,
with him.
yeah, and he has this phrase where he says, "Serving is below you, then leadership is above you." And I was like,
Mm,
"That's pretty good."
that is a good one.
Yeah. So that to your point,
Yeah.
humble service is a requirement for leadership.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, and if somebody's in a leadership role and they do think it's all about power and self-service, that's not a very good leader. Not a leader that most people want to be
Right.
around.
Yeah.
So as we talk about this, thinking about, you know, ultimately Jesus is the example of all of these things:
Mm-hmm.
forgiveness, faith, and service. And you think about the crucifixion in particular. So Jesus on the cross is an example of forgiveness because he's forgiving the people who are literally crucifying him,
Mm-hmm.
and those who are mocking him and making fun of him as he's being crucified on the cross.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. There's this heart of forgiveness, even as he's actively being killed unjustly by crowds and the soldiers and the religious leaders and the Roman power, like all converging together to take his life, and he's forgiving.
Mm-hmm.
Why did he forgive? Like, why was he able to do that? I think we get a piece of it in Hebrews, where it talks about for the joy that was set before him, his faith, because of what he knew the reward was on the other side, he was willing to endure the cross and all of the shame of it. And so setting an example of faith and confidence that comes because he knew what his father had for him on the other side of that suffering. And I think the suffering and death on the cross was the sort of the culmination of the service that he came to bring. And Jesus in his teaching in the gospel says, I came not to be served, but to serve. And so I think in all these ways that we're talking about, various examples that we set and watch
Mm-hmm.
from other people ultimately roll up to Jesus. And we're looking to him as our example in all of these things as well as our Savior and our
Mhm.
King. But it's just like everything in the Christian faith,
Mhm.
it comes back to the heart of Jesus and who he is. And where we see good examples, it's coming from the ultimate example of Jesus at work, created in his image. And the more we grow in our spiritual maturity, the more we're reflecting Jesus' own capacity to forgive, his own capacity for faith, his own capacity for service. And so it's the Holy Spirit sort of doing these things inside of us through the ministry of the examples that we can learn from, for good or ill,
Mhm.
as he's growing us up.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's a great way to wrap up this conversation is just that I think that's part of our role as Christians is how can we look to Jesus as our example in a way that shapes
Yeah.
who we are. And there's all kinds of research that shows that what you focus on impacts who you become. And so if you're focusing on the example of Jesus, specifically the forgiveness aspect, the faith aspect, the service
Mhm.
aspect, that's going to shape those things in you. A lot of the examples you have in your life, maybe they are that way because they followed the example of
Yeah.
Jesus. And I think that's a beautiful thing.
That's in Hebrews as well. Fix
Yep.
your eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith.
Yep.
Whether you've been at it for a day
Yeah.
or a lifetime,
Yeah.
the focus is still the same.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And no matter where you're at, we're called to have faith like a child.
Yeah.
So that when we depend on God, it puts us all on the same playing
Yeah.
field. No matter how much Bible knowledge we have, no matter how many times we've read the Bible, if you're willing to depend on Him and surrender, then you're in the same place
Yeah.
as someone who's been following Jesus.
We don't
for years.
outgrow that.
Right.
Yeah.
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 That's good.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys for tuning in this week. We hope this has been a helpful conversation for you, and we hope you'll take time to think about those examples in your own life and maybe have a conversation with someone else or a group of individuals similar to what me and Anton did today. I think it would be really beneficial. We'll see you again next week, but we hope you all have a great week. Hey, everyone. Thanks for listening to the end of the episode. If you're enjoying these conversations each week, do us a favor. Hit that subscribe button right here on YouTube or the follow button wherever you listen to podcasts. It's quick, it's free, it's easy, and it makes a huge difference in helping our podcast reach more people in the Lake Norman community. Thank you for supporting the For Lake Norman podcast, and we hope you have a great week.